So tonight we'll be, Herb is going to speak about faith and decision again, exploring step 2 in yet more detail. This is another step in our series of discussions, like I said, that will be continuing through 2022 around the practice of the 12 steps to achieve emotional sobriety. And with that, I turn you over to Herb. Hi, Herb. Good to see you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good day. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction and for the generous invitation to support the people who attend this group for all year long. It's wonderful. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. That's my website. Lots of resources, all downloadable, all for free. And so they may be helpful. So here we are. Step 2, came to believe. And Susie, thank you for teeing it up in such a wonderful way. Those 2 questions were given to me in 1994. I was 10 years sober. My sobriety date is February 21st, 1984. A story for a different day. The key point, though, is that I came into AA in that year and got a sponsor and worked the steps on my own and had no experience with it. I didn't know that I didn't have any experience with it. I went to a meeting every day. I called my sponsor every day, probably for at least 10 years. Yeah, 10 years. I don't know why I was willing to do that, but he suggested it, so I did it. I worked the steps in that first year. I had no experience, no change with that. I didn't know that change was necessary or even possible. Obviously, I didn't know the process of change. In 1988, 4 years sober, I did the work for the very first time out of the big book with a mechanic, a big book mechanic, meaning a step guide that really understood and had an experience with the big book application of the step process, the precise directions from the big book. And I had a very powerful experience with step 1, the doctor's opinion. I had other experiences, but nothing with 2 and 3. I studied to be a Catholic priest. Late 50s, early 60s, I was there for 7 years in a monastery, 7 years of silence. I loved it. I loved the solitude. I loved the camaraderie. I loved the content of the study process. In 1964, I left that monastery and I hung up my black robe and I didn't meditate again for another 25 years. Despite the fact I'm in AA in 1984, I'm not a meditator at that point. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know why to do it. So I didn't do it, even though it's step 11. This man who took me through the steps in 1988 changed all of that because I went through the step 4 material and had a spiritual awakening for the very first time. I was changed radically. And he introduced me to step 11, a story for a different time. And certainly in November, we'll be looking at that, at least my experience with it. But the point is, no new experience, despite a spiritual awakening, no new experience with the Spirit, steps 2 and 3. 1991, 3 years later, a replica of that experience. I had a new experience with step 1 about obsession and compulsion. I understood the problem of the mind, which gave me a deeper appreciation of addiction. I had a new experience in step 4. I'll talk about that when I get there. I had no new experience with steps 2 and 3. Despite at that point, I'm having a daily practice of meditation. No new experience with steps 2 and 3. By my current observation, at that time, I didn't know that I didn't know. 1994, and this is the point. Step 2 says came to believe. Now I know that's a process, not an event. It's not a light switch. It's a dimmer switch. In my case. And those two questions that Susie repeated, those were the curtain-rending questions for me. The curtains parted. I wrote a treatise on the first question when it was asked of me. This man had given me the set-aside prayer for the very first time. This man had introduced me to unmanageability, the second half of the first step, those bedevilments and the self-centeredness that is the root of the problem. And I had a new experience with step 1, 10 years of sobriety. And then he asked me in going into step 2, what do you actually believe? Well, are you kidding? I'm a theologian in my delusion because I spent 7 years in a monastery. I'm not a theologian. I'm not qualified. I'm not trained to. I'm not certified. But in my delusion, I was. And I'm a good writer, so my thesis, my poetry was beautiful and theologically actually quite correct. Theology is the study of God. It's not a relationship with God. And I didn't know that. And then when I delivered that to him, he gave me that second question. They were a week apart. Go home now and write. How do you behave in light of what you wrote about what you believe was startling. As Susie indicated, there was such a dissonance between what I thought I believed and how I actually behaved that I realized that my belief was a delusion. It was an old idea, which made going through chapter 4 effective for the very first time. And that's what I'm going to recap. Last 2 weeks ago, exposure to my journey in step 2, and then get to the final piece of the answers to the questions in chapter 4. Bill asks us questions. At the beginning, almost of every step in the big book. One of my teachers says, ask the question and hold the question and allow the asked but unanswered question to bubble and percolate, especially in the milieu of prayer, that set-aside prayer, that set-aside attitude. And then be willing to be delivered to a place that you didn't even know existed. That sounds woo-woo and new agey, maybe a little vague. It's not. After you do it and look back over your shoulder, you will have an experience with being delivered. And so here we are at step 2. Came to believe a process, that a power. All right. Your choice. Step 2 is a choice. Excuse me. I'll be asking more about that in a minute, or reminding you more about my comments about that and my experience with that. Could restore us. You hear a lot of commentary. Some of it might be helpful. Some of it's quite nonsensical. In meetings about sanity and insanity and restore us and was I ever, and oh my God, save me. What does the big book actually mean? Could restore us to sanity. Bill's very clear in the big book about that. When you find it, sanity. He revealed it in step 1. He revealed it on pages 35 to 37, Jim's story, the car salesman. We'll talk about that in a minute. But on page 47, Bill asks us, or begins to suggest to us, that there's a spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. He doesn't tell us about step one being the foundation, but it's assumed if he gives us this metaphor of a spiritual arch through which we walk to freedom, that there's a foundation. And he gives us this metaphor on page 47 at the beginning of step 4. So he's already assuming that we've established this foundation. It took me 10 years to build. Experientially, but even intellectually, academically, to understand the nature of the body problem, the nature of the mind problem, the nature of the will problem. But then on page 47, he says we place the cornerstone on this foundation with willingness. And if I were to use one word to describe my entire journey, it was willingness. I don't know why I was willing. That's a grace in itself. And that's a conversation for a different day. The dance between willingness and grace. I was willing to be taken, but I was taken. I was willing. That's my part. I was taken. That's God's part. At least God is, I don't understand it. More about that in a minute. Bill on page 47 says, willingness is all that matters. Do you believe? Well, maybe not. It's early in the chapter. He gives us a fallback position. Are you willing to believe? Well, if you had any taste of your head getting kicked in from addiction and unmanageability, you're willing to consider a power other than yourself, because if you're like me, you've tried all of the self-help mechanisms available to you that's conscious to you in the cafeteria of human development, and they didn't work. So we are willing, we answer that question, yes, I'm at least willing. Bill says that's all you need to commence, meaning to begin this journey. Of course, in step 3, he talks about the keystone. I'll come to that next month. And in step 9, he suggests that's the completion of the program of recovery. But at the beginning of step 5, at the end of step 5 on page 75, he said, now you've walked through the arch to a new freedom. The whole point of this journey is not alcohol. The whole point of this journey is not unmanageability. The whole point of this journey is freedom from our addiction and freedom from our unmanageability. Walking through this spiritual arch, a process, not an event, a journey, not a destination. We're in bondage of our addiction until we finish the first 9 steps, and Bill says we're placed in a position of neutrality. But we're not cured. We still have unmanageability. Addiction is the problem that 1 out of 10 or 5 out of 10, a percentage of people have. Unmanageability is the human problem. 10 out of 10 have unmanageability. On page 62, Bill says selfishness, self-centeredness is the root. He calls it a spiritual malady. He calls it a cancer of the soul. Notice the difference between that first cartoon and this cartoon is that in this one, it's very clear with a perspective, there's nothing holding the bars in front of me except my 2 hands. And I'm looking through the bars as if I'm in jail, and there's no ceiling, there's no walls, there's no floor. Steps 4 through 9 allow me to identify those bars, to identify that I'm holding them, and to drop the bars. But he introduces us on page 53 This is a recap of last time. The real step 2. God is or God isn't. What is your choice? Step 2 is a decision. Now, it doesn't say it in the step itself like it does in step 3. Step 3 says we made a decision. Not step 2 doesn't. It says came to believe, meaning a process. But on page 53, Bill tells us God is or God isn't. What is your choice? It's a decision about power. Your concept, please get really clear here if you're not. We, in any of the 12-step programs, have no theology, have no dogma, have nothing that you need to believe given from the book or the fellowship or any person. The invitation is for you to choose. And on page 53, Bill says, God is or God isn't. What is your choice? What is your choice? See, my synonym for powerlessness, because we become so brain dead to that word, powerless. Oh, yes, I'm powerless over people, places, and things people mouth without any consciousness of what they're talking about. It's not people, places, and things. Give me a break. Listen to what you're saying. People and circumstances, that works. I am powerless over people and circumstances. Reality just is. My problem is I take it personally. And reality is not personal. It just is what it is. I need to accept that and adjust to that. But that's what I learned in steps 4 through 9. Learned experientially, not just intellectually. Here in step 2, Bill says on page 53, we are confronted with the question of faith. I did a little diagram last time. It'll be in one of my PowerPoint presentations in my Tuesday workshop if you want to go back through that. My decision is an act of faith. My decision is an act of faith. You look up that word in a dictionary, you'll be very confused because it's very unclear. At least faith is not knowledge and faith is not emotion. I didn't know what it was until I looked at the first step, which is about the body and the mind and the will. The body with addiction, the allergy. The mind with the obsession. An ability to know but not to be hijacked by that thought. And my will, the root cause of my unmanageability, self-will, run riot. And I'm powerless in step 1, in unmanageability. I am powerless in my will. And yet Bill is asking us with our will to make a decision. Oh, I'm not making a decision about addiction. I'm not making a decision about unmanageability. I'm making a decision about power or no power, God or no God. That's the proper use of the will, a decision. Bill says is the cornerstone. The first stone placed on the foundation that sets the direction of the entire arch. Well, on page 45, he had asked us at the very beginning of the chapter, where and how am I going to find this power? He says, lack of power is our dilemma. Our addiction's not the problem. It is a problem. It's not the problem. The problem is an ineffective relationship with power. I'm going to avoid the use of the term God as much as possible. Not because I have any concern about the word God, but you might. God is not the God reality. God is the symbol of the reality for which there is no symbol. It is the symbol of the reality for which there is no word. Because any word that we use is a finite word to try to capture an infinite reality. Image. You go to the beach and there's the ocean and you have a little bucket and you want to take the ocean home with you. But you can't take the ocean home with you because your bucket's too small. No, I remember that from the second grade. It was such a powerful image. Whatever the ocean is, it will not fit in the bucket because that's my bucket and it's too small for the large ocean. That's why the words in the big book are brilliant, God as we understand God, but they'd actually be more brilliant if it was God as we don't understand it. We're not going to change the big book. So on page 45, he says, how are we going to find this power? Lack of power is our dilemma. How are we going to find it? And where? Oops, got ahead of myself there. I did it again. And where are we going to find it? Again, two very powerful questions. At the very beginning of the chapter. Now, he spends the next 10 pages giving us poetry, giving us philosophy, giving us theology, giving us science, giving us emotion, giving us salesmanship. 10 pages. The most important page is 53 because he tells us about faith and the choice. God is or God isn't. That's step 2. We'll come back to that at the end of my conversation with you today. So on page 55, he has 2 paragraphs there. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but God is there. God is as much a fact as we are. We found the great reality. Pay attention to initial words with a capital letter. Words with initial letter that's capital. We found a great reality, capital G, capital R. That's a synonym. God as we don't understand it. Power as we need it. The great reality. Wonderful term. Bill has lots of wonderful synonyms trying to help us get a little traction with this reality that has no words that are adequate, but has lots of symbols. Get the one that you resonate with. That's the whole point of step 2. What do you resonate with as a word or a phrase that's a symbol of this reality of power that we need in order to live? We found a great reality deep down within us. Oh, that's the answer to where. In the last analysis, it is only there that God can be found. In the last analysis, after all the reading, all the thinking, all the writing, all the talking, all the praying, all the meditating, in the last analysis, reinforced if you've read, and I hope you have, Appendix 2, which tells us why we're doing this work in the first place, a spiritual awakening. What is that? In there's this fabulous phrase. It's a crossover phrase from the one page to the next page. Unsuspected inner resource. Unsuspected, 10 years sober, having studied to be a Catholic priest, having been a monk for 7 years in silence. Completely unsuspected that this power, this spirit, this entity, this reality was in fact the warp and woof of my very being, the soul of my soul. The anima, that which animates me. Unsuspected inner resource. This is such an important concept Bill gives us it again. Where do we find it? Deep inside. How and where? He gives us a second paragraph that's almost redundant, which is very unlike Bill's style. He said in answer to the question about step 6 and step 7, character defects and whatever the other word is in step 6 or 7, that's a synonym for that. He said, oh, they're the same. I was taught in basic English language to use the, never to put the same word in consecutive sentences. Defects of character and shortcomings. That's the word I was missing. He said, they're the same. They're synonyms for one another. So he avoids using the same word in consecutive sentences. So when he apparently gives us some apparent redundancy, we know that it's very intentional, it's very conscious, because it's such an important concept. He does it here and he does it in the fourth step. We can clear the ground a bit if our testimony sweeps away prejudice. How wonderful he's incorporating that set-aside attitude, that set-aside approach. Sweep away prejudice. Have an open whiteboard, a clean blank slate, and let the Spirit write on it. Enables you to think honestly. That's how. Encourages you to search diligently. Well, he's already given us the word search fearlessly in the paragraph above. Now he's saying search diligently. Thinking's good, but searching's better, obviously. The use of the mind is important to understand, but the use of the will to take action. 2-to-1 ratio here. Within yourself. Where? Deep down inside. Then if you wish, you can join us. This is one of the second step promises. On the broad highway. What a wonderful term, capital B, capital H. On the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. With this attitude, you cannot fail. Well, what attitude? Oh, think honestly, search diligently, search fearlessly. And it came to mind this image of a sailboat. I'm not a sailor, but I understand some of it. And I've been on a boat and I have read a little bit and I hear the jargon. The attitude is the position of the mast so that the sail catches the wind to empower the boat forward. With this attitude, the right position, the right stance, I will catch the wind. The word spirit comes from the Greek spiros, S-P-I-R-O-S, which means breath. With the right attitude, with the right stance, I can catch the spirit that will empower me if I think honestly and search diligently and search fearlessly. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. Well, what's about this restore us to sanity business? I mentioned that in my opening comments. Bill gives us a story of Jim, the car salesman that put a little whiskey in his milk. And at the end of that, on page 37, Bill gives us a nice description of sanity and insanity. He says, whatever the precise page 37, whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. That is, putting a little whiskey in milk and it'll be okay on a stomach that's already digested a sandwich or two. This man, every time he drinks, goes to the insane asylum. No stop. Every time he drinks, he goes to the insane asylum back in the day. And yet, the thought comes to him, it'll be different this time. That's the definition of insanity that we all know in the rooms. Doing the same thing over, expecting different results, sometimes even expecting better results. Whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. And he defines it now. A lack of proportion, a lack of the ability to think straight. Well, what really will help, I believe, is understanding the root of the word sanity. It comes from Latin, S-A-N-U-S, sanus, which means health. And when you put an I-N in front of it, it means not healthy. That's all it means. It doesn't, in the big book, mean crazy, psychiatric, or psychological. It has no implication in that area, please. You don't need to make a big deal out of it in the meetings, but please don't repeat ignorance. It's not about crazy. When we use whatever addiction that we have, we do crazy things, of course. But the craziest thing we ever do is pick up a drink or pick up our addiction after a period of abstinence. That's what he's talking about. And it's not crazy, it's just unhealthy. It's a lack of proportion, a lack of the ability to think straight, connected to that obsession that he talked about in his material, pages 23 to 43. Especially with the examples of Fred the car salesman, Jim the car salesman, and Fred the accountant. In fact, the accountant had such a great insight. He used the term a strange mental blank spot. An obsession is a thought that fills the screen of our consciousness in such a way that there is no other thought. A strange mental blank spot, like a whiteout. It's the only reality we can see. It'll be different this time, and we follow through. The difference between an obsession and a thought is a thought you have some management of. It's the broad category. Obsession is a particular kind of thought. We talked about that in our first sessions on step 1. Obsession hijacks us without our permission and without our consciousness. There's no management of obsession. There's only protection from it. That's why Bill says at the end of the 9th step, we are placed in a position of neutrality. Hear the language. Bill's precise. We are placed, delivered grace to a place of neutrality. Neutrality, we're not fighting it, we're not resisting it, we're not attracted to it, we're not conscious of it. Neutrality, Bill calls that recovered. Look at the title page. How thousands of men and women have recovered. That's the term he uses throughout the book. Recovered. It's over. It's past tense. Once you've done the first 9 steps, it's past tense. As long as you take care of yourself spiritually, because we're not cured. Not cured of what? Our unmanageability. That selfishness, self-centeredness. Read page 62. We're as powerless over our willpower in our manageability as we are over our addiction. I read it before. I'm prompted to read it again only because it's so powerful. Page 62. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. You can work the steps and you can get free from addiction, but you cannot get free from unmanageability. We have a daily reprieve, contingent on our spiritual condition. We commenced this way of living as we cleaned up the past 10, 11, and 12. These are not options if you want to stay sober. These are not options if you want to have a decent human life. These are the tools that we engage in on a daily basis. Step 10, spot check inventory when we're disturbed. Step 11, in the morning, getting guidance. And step 11, in the night, inventory to see how we did. And step 12, practicing principles. We become so brain dead to the use of these words, and yet they're very powerful indicators. Principles, that's just reality as it is, adjusting to reality as it is. We need spirit shield. In the past, I've used a shield of spirituality. In preparing yesterday for this, it came to me, it's a much tighter phrase, a spirit shield. Think of Star Wars. When the starship has a shield protecting it, it's invulnerable to attack. But if there's a defect in the shield or the shield is not engaged, then the starship is vulnerable. We have a spirit shield if we do 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis. It's optional in the sense that you can do it or not, but it's like Russian roulette. Although in our case, the 6 chambers of the gun have 5 bullets. The odds are not in our favor. We need a spiritual shield. This is reality. The logo of Alcoholics Anonymous for a long time was the circle with the triangle. And Al-Anon, when it was created, I believe in 1953, maybe 1951, reversed it and put the circle inside the triangle. Each indicates our relationship with spirit. Spiros, the breath, the broad highway, the God of our not understanding, presides over us, he says on page 14. Simple, but not easy. The price has to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. We must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. Powerful. We'll talk more about that when we come to step 3. A relationship with a power other than ourselves. The key word is power. Whether or not you believe in a spirit, whether or not you believe in a God, whether or not you believe in anything to do with spirituality in a traditional or non-traditional sense, it doesn't make any difference as long as you believe that there is a power accessible to you, that is in you and that is not you. Dr. Berger, who attends these very regularly with his own interpretation and experience with emotional sobriety, talks about the higher self and the lower self, the best in me managing the worst in me, the spirit deep inside. The circle is an ancient symbol for this mystery. The triangle is a symbol for certainly the moving parts of AA steps and traditions and concepts, but it's also the symbol of a human being, body, mind, and will. And Al-Anon put the spirit deep inside of us, that circle inside the human, both representing spirit everywhere. God is or God isn't. What is your choice? And then he says, God is everything or God is nothing. there is a power that is everything, or there is no such power. Think about that. That's the invitation that we have. A decision about power. I'm leaving you now with that question for you to ask yourself. What is your choice about power for you? What do you want? No, I'm inviting you, not maybe right now to come to a conclusion, but to embrace this question. What do you want as a power other than yourself? What are the attributes and the qualities that you need? The attributes and qualities that you need. Well, clearly power, if I don't have sufficient power, and then with an eye on the third step, perhaps a caring power. That's the key word in the third step. Turn my life and my will, whatever that means, and we'll explore that, over to the care of God. Please, I'm going to make such a point of this that you might get tired of it. We don't turn our will and our life over to God. God is not going to manage my life. Please. I mean, I would go so far as to say, and I've written about it, God doesn't have a plan. God doesn't have a will. Well, what does Bill mean? What does the big book mean about God's will then? Yep, I'm raising some questions. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I'm certainly raising the questions. And we'll talk about it in March. What's your concept? See, that's the whole point of step 2. A decision about power, to come up with your concept, the word that you want, the word that you need, the phrase that you want, the phrase that you need. In step 2, Bill's brilliant in the 12 and 12. He said, maybe the group, if you have any problem with any other word, but choose your choice. Maybe the group, they have something that you don't have, at the very least sobriety and at the very most happiness. Maybe the group will be sufficient. A wonderful idea, a wonderful, gentle, accessible idea, especially for newcomers. But preparing you for this next assignment now, pages 58 to 63, step 3, pages 58 to 63. Now, you've already read, if you followed the bouncing ball with my assignments on this journey with the Berlin group, you've already read pages 60 to 62 in the context of unmanageability, but you could read it again. But read and highlight pages 58 to 63. It's about step 3. Step 3 very clearly is a decision. It says it right in the step, a decision. This is the use of your will, your free will. We don't have freedom with regard to our addiction. We're powerless, no choice. We don't have freedom with regard to our managing our lives. That's the whole point of unmanageability. We're not cured of our unmanageability. But we make a decision to turn. What does that mean? Bill asked that question on page 60. What does it mean? What do we do? Great questions. I believe what he means is pages 60 to 62, that our free will is not free until we learn that the proper use of the will is God or no God. And what do we do? Pages 60 to 60, 62 to 63 talks about a relationship. Now, it's not this clear in terms of the use of the words, but take a look at the bottom paragraph on page 62 and the first and second paragraphs on page 63. Bill is suggesting relationships with this power. a decision for a relationship. And here's the question that I would love you to hold in the milieu of the set-aside attitude and the set-aside prayer. What do you yearn for? What does your soul, the marrow of your bones, yearn for in a relationship? With God, with higher power, with spirit, with yourself, with life, with reality. You choose your words. It doesn't make any difference what your word is or how you define it, as long as it's some type of life force or source or energy or nature that is a healing, carrying power. That's the whole point of steps 2 and 3. A healing, caring power. What do you yearn for?